first question, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about questions I got last time. And one of the questions was, who is she, right? She being me. So I just want to kind of give you a little bit, find a little bit of an idea who I am and how I came to be here. So I came to the United States when I was 25, that was like 33 years ago. And when I was in Germany, I studied theater and German literature. And the only other thing I ever done is I worked with kids in the summer camp for disabilities. So that's why I got my first job here, because the theater and German literature in America was not that much that I could do. Ever since then, I've been working originally in child welfare, and then kind of started also working with people with really severe disabilities, including children and adults who have spent most of their lives in institutions, have a history of hospitalization, and really we have worked to find innovative ways to kind of address and understand behaviors. The reason why I'm so excited to be here, because you are a very different audience from my social workers and staff and psychology students that on occasion I teach, because most of you are not working in human services. And the reason why I'm excited for you to be here is because I think many times when we talk about challenging behaviors and trauma and sexual abuse and physical abuse and people with schizophrenia and all different kinds of things, we really kind of refer to or think about people as those people with mental illness, right? Those people with issues, right? And they're different. And and we often medicalize mental health, we pathologize mental health and disability. And I find that really often not helpful, because particularly in this day and age, we really need to work together to understand and embrace human behavior in general. So if you look at, for example, the amount of children that are coming up through the system that have autism, I'm sure most of you know somebody who has a disability or has a child with autism, a neighbor with autism, and yet still autism is somewhat mystified, right? The other people are not social, they're not talking, they really don't like being with people, and that is simply not true. They're different, they're socially different maybe, they want to interact on this peripheral of social life, not in the midst of things. They may communicate by pointing or facial expressions, but they still do. And I think that it's really important for us to understand that behaviors, normal behaviors and not so normal behaviors, and sometimes people call them maladaptive or deviant, are really, really kind of close together. The gap of behaviors is pretty close together. And for those of you who have joined me last time, I said that, that basically, the way we all behaving is logical, it makes sense, that makes behavior predictable, it makes it exciting. So we can say, for example, safely predict if a boy was sexually abused prior to the age of 3 for a prolonged period of time, say in 2 to 3 months, the likelihood that that child is becoming engaging in extreme power and control seeking behaviors, such as cruelty to animals, fire setting, or becoming a perpetrator, no matter what happens after the abuse, no matter how much money we spend on therapy and treatment, is fairly high. We can assume that, if somebody has been hit by their parents twice at the age of 8, that child most likely will turn out to be okay, right? So I think, again, behavior is logical, we can predict it. All of us behave in similar ways, right? We talked about last time about, after 9/11, and I'm sure right now, the amount of superstition after 9/11 went really up significantly. And superstition is our way to kind of get control over something that we perceive to be uncontrollable. Whether it's COVID-19 or 9/11, the amount of superstition most likely is going to go up. In one of the last sessions, somebody asked the question, how do I know if I have OCD, right? And so again, this gives us a nice example to recap a little bit from last time. Obsessive compulsive behaviors, most of us engage in. When we feel that our life is out of control, I don't know about you, but I, for example, like to go home and to vacuum, right? I like to clean, because if nothing else, I can control nothing else. At least I can control the cleanliness of my house, right? So that is something that makes ourselves feel good, because the tendency, human tendency is always, when we feel bad about something, we want to make ourselves feel better. So that is if you so will, maybe it's a compulsive behavior, right? That I have to go clean, but it is not a disorder. A disorder were to be if I would have to compulsively clean my house for 3 hours and 22 minutes every morning before I could leave. That behavior then, that compulsion, interferes with my ability to function. So when we look at behavior, I don't look at behavior according to diagnoses. I look at behavior as how does it impact our ability to function? And to kind of gain control over an uncontrollable world is something that all of us do. We talked a lot about power and control last time, or not a lot, we only had 45 minutes, but we talked about power and control seeking behaviors. So many times, particularly, when kids had kind of disempowering childhood experiences, they often engage in power and control seeking behaviors, right? Kids may become angry, they hit, they scream, they do whatever. It's just an attempt to kind of gain control over what's happening there. If you look at, for example, the stages of grieving we're going to talk about, we didn't talk about that last time. There is, in the stages of grieving, there's actually an anger stage. I'm going to talk about that a little bit also in the COVID context. And that is really kind of to address anxiety. So anger is really kind of our way to mask and address intense feelings of anxiety that we cannot handle. Right? Does that make sense? So behavior is really, really very logical. While we're all individuals, while we're all different, while we're all unique in our makeup, in our experiences, in our upbringing, because behavior is logical, behavior goes in the same direction. Behavior really has two purposes. One is to avoid something, and one other thing is to get something, to gain something. Those are really the two kind of tiers of behavior, right? The getting something is easier. The avoiding something is much harder. Avoiding behaviors are much more complex. Behaviors always make sense in the reality of the person who is behaving in a particular way. Last time, and I will use this example again, I used sexual abuse in girls. Girls who have been sexually abused, they cope, and there's a profound difference with the way of how boys and girls cope with their sexual abuse. So girls who are sexually abused, for example, develop really poor hygiene. They become bedwetters. They like to dress in baggy clothes. So if you think about it, in the reality of that sexually abused child, it makes perfect sense because she's trying to make herself unattractive, right? So to prevent further abuse from happening. The next thing is many times, girls, develop power and control issues, all the way from your standard difficulty with authority to developing an eating disorder. An eating disorder is actually about power and control. They are not about food. So that also is because she felt disempowered during the sexual abuse, therefore she's engaging in these kinds of behaviors. And the last one is promiscuity. And that's a little bit harder to understand, but many times girls who are sexually abused misunderstand or misinterpret, sexual contact for love, because that's the only way how they learn to felt love and affection. So within the reality of a child who's experienced sexual abuse, that makes perfect sense. The challenge is many times for us in general, when some of the behaviors work in the reality and in the context, out of the context or out of the experience of sexual abuse, it doesn't work. Because now we have a kid who needs to go and take showers, right? In order to kind of function in society, in order to be healthy, in order to not be fun of by her peers. So that's where the challenge comes in. And that's where we have to look at how we can change behaviors. So the mark for behaviors is really what works for us and what doesn't work for us. What works for us, we want to keep. What doesn't work for us is where we want to look at how we want to change. What we've established also is that early childhood experiences have a profound impact. So whatever happened to us during early childhood determines a lot of our future, how we see the world, how we relate to people, our ability to feel happy, to connect to others, to be successful. A lot of it depends on early childhood, particularly pre-verbal experiences. And people often say to me, Daniela, pre-verbal doesn't make any sense, right? People won't even remember, right? If something happened to them when they're 3 months old or 6 months old, how can they remember? That doesn't have a big impact. And therein exactly lies the problem. If we have an experience at the age of 10, we can verbalize it, we can talk about it, we can put it in perspective. It has a very different lasting effect than if we have an early childhood experience that we cannot verbalize, we cannot recall. It almost becomes the fabric of who we are. So for those of you who have joined last time, I'm going to give an example that includes something new, right? And in our recap of last time. So for example, a child bonding with a primary caregiver is one of the major indicators of emotional health. So bonding, it does not have to be a parent, but a child, particularly during the first few months to 2 years of life, must form bonds with a caregiver, consistent bonds. There needs to be, because children really develop their core beliefs and their way how they see in the world based on those first experiences. So last time I used the example of Russian orphanages, right? So the kid is born in a Russian orphanage and is crying, is hungry, nobody comes to feed them. They're wet, nobody comes to change them. They want to cuddle, nobody comes to cuddle them, right? So infants are brilliant little people. So what they do, in essence, is to numb their emotions, to not feel this kind of, I want something, and then it's not going to happen. The problem with the numbing of emotions is that, it numbs, it's basically like a protective wall that goes around all the kids, so nothing goes out and nothing comes in. Those are the little guys that are 6 and they're falling and they're skimming their knee, right? And they're bleeding. They don't feel anything because the numbing of emotions, and therein lies actually a big thing for change, this is the numbing of emotions also extends to sensory kind of issues. So kids don't feel that as much as other kids do. They don't feel, they either underreact or overreact to touch and to feelings. So really the entire being is numbed. The problem with that is that those kids develop what they call reactive attachment disorder. And again, we have attachment issues and disorder. Reactive attachment disorder is really kids' inability to form healthy attachments with others based on that initial protective mechanism. And kids with reactive attachment disorder run really a great risk of developing significant issues in life. They cannot read social cues like other kids can. They score on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, and their ability to read social cues. They engage in power and control seeking behaviors. They lie. Lying is a very pervasive power and control seeking behavior, so they excessively lie. They're very impulsive. They cannot feel empathy. Not because they don't want to feel empathy, they cannot. So it's really kind of one of the very, very challenging childhood experience. Things like physical abuse or sexual abuse is one of the most devastating, but it can be devastating. The early childhood inability to attach is really pretty significant. Now, the new part here is that, and that we didn't talk about that last time, is that as kids grow up, then kids with reactive attachment disorder develop what's called borderline personality disorders as adults. And personality disorders, we did not talk about last time, is really a cluster of behaviors and thoughts and emotions that continue to present, regularly over time. So in borderline personality disorders, and I don't know if you know somebody who has a member, because it can be quite challenging. People with borderline personality disorders are really good in kind of poking at you and trying to get you to behave in an extreme way. Because people with borderline personality disorders and also kids with reactive attachment disorders, they do not understand subtle, right? So they're living in a constant state of anxiety because they cannot read social cues, right? Like right now, I cannot read a lot of social cues. I can read Michelle. She gives me some feedback and like her interest, and but I cannot read a lot of social cues. It makes me feel a little anxious, right? Now remember, you cannot read your environment all the time. You do not know, do people like you, not like you? Are you in danger? You cannot read social cues. And that causes an enormous amount of anxiety that causes people with borderline personality disorders and children with that, as we call it, to really evoke extreme emotions in you. So they try to really piss you off, because if you're just a little bit angry, they cannot read it. But if you're really angry, they're like, oh, thank God, I can feel something. I know what's happening. Kids do not understand how to join a play group. They do not understand, what is an expected emotions. Many times kids with that and adults with borderline personality disorder, they will react emotionally in a way that they think they should react because they can't feel anything. So for example, I have a young woman who also has fetal alcohol syndrome and borderline personality disorder that often goes together. And, she got a goldfish at Walmart and the goldfish died. So she was hysterically sobbing about the goldfish dying. I said, it's not a reason for you to cry this much. You didn't have a relationship with the goldfish. It's only, been here for a day. You need to stop crying. And she stopped crying, but she thought she was expected to do this way, right? So, people with borderline personality disorders are often incarcerated, often develop substance abuse issues. Again, they're very impulsive. So it's just kind of, and also, kind of to show you that, these early childhood experiences really kind of have a long-term effect. The other thing we talked a lot about last time was trauma. So again, any kind of abuse, neglect, first of all of us have experienced trauma. Trauma is nothing else but our inability to cope with an event at the moment of it happening, right? So that is basically trauma. All of us have experienced trauma to various degrees. We have experienced a traumatic event. So for example, if somebody rear-ends you, right? And you kind of get shaken up because you didn't see it coming, right? For the next 4 weeks or so, you might look behind you and just make sure that nobody's coming to hit you again, right? That is just an episode of traumatic stress. It is not, it's not PTSD, it's not, significant trauma. Trauma, similarly in its occurrence, has the most effects, if it's experienced in early childhood. If it's experienced in a complex way. So we have pervasive trauma. So for example, people who are in a domestic violence relationship who have the same kind of trauma by being hit by, significant others or whoever, that would be kind of a pretty significant traumatic cluster event. So that is of course much worse than, single event of trauma. But then we have complex trauma, and complex trauma often has its roots in childhood and really consists of adverse childhood experiences that we talked about last time a little bit, like, divorce of a parent. Military families, it's kind of interesting. I had Shana, I don't know if you're on there, but somebody named Shana called me and she asked me about military families and, coping with, COVID. Parents of kids with disabilities coping with COVID during this time. And we talked about really even moving for military families who have children with disabilities to move. Every single move is a trauma event for a child because consistent moving, even as a well-adjusted person, is really hard. But for a child with disabilities in particular, we are traumatizing this child each time a child with disability should move. It has to move. So even that is kind of a cumulative trauma if you think about it. So trauma is again, pretty pervasive. Trauma, the other question was, we also talked about core beliefs, and I'm trying to mix in a little bit old and new so that the new old people don't get too bored. We talked about core beliefs. So in early childhood, we're developing really core beliefs about ourselves, who we are, what we do. Are we lovable? Are we, worth something? Are we, do people like us? So we really develop these core beliefs based on these early kind of, experiences. So somebody asked last time in the questions at the end, what are the 3 core beliefs that are linked to trauma? What kind of, core beliefs do we have? And core beliefs are really interesting because core beliefs is something that really defines our way of thinking. So for example, if I think I am not a good employee, right? I'm really inadequate, I'm not a good employee. And I get reprimanded for something. I use it to sustain my core belief, right? Which is, see, I know I'm not a good employee. If I do something brilliant and my supervisor says to me, hey, Daniela, that was awesome. My core belief says that was just an accident. I'm really not good enough, right? So the core beliefs really kind of function as filters through which we see everything else, all new experiences we're sorting in. I gave the example last time in my trainings, I always ask this question. You're going on a date, your date is not coming, right? So what are your thoughts? And there are always 3 groups of people. People who think that the date is hanging somewhere on the tree, dead, bleeding into the road, right? Those kids or those people most likely have had unpredictable events. They had unpredictable things that have happened to them that led to catastrophic thinking. We have a lot of catastrophic thinking. Those are also people who have a tendency to go into kind of negative thought patterns. I don't know if you ever had that experience. When I was working in for child welfare, actually for DCF, and bureaucracies and I did not mix well. Sometimes when a supervisor would say something to me, and I would go to my car in Boston traffic hour, right? And I'd say, I can't believe she said that to me, right? And then I was down the street, 200 yards further after an hour, I said, oh, last week she said something to me, and the week before, and I bet you she's talking to me behind my back about all these different kinds of people. So we kind of think in our way up, right? Which is kind of an interesting thing. The other group of people, saying the date doesn't show up, I got dumped, right? nobody wants me. I got stood up again, because most of us might have had the experience of somebody leaving us. So we use that kind of, to kind of think that way. And other people may say, well, he or she might have forgotten their cell phone, have a flat tire, right, or running late. So the way how we are, perceiving events really kind of goes down to core beliefs. So the 3 core beliefs trauma, to answer your question from last week, is the world is not a safe place. So the world is inherently a dangerous place. At any given time, anything can happen, right? So I had hoped to talk a little bit more today also about brain chemistry. So it's really interesting because people who've experienced trauma, early childhood or later, whenever, they're always on the peripheral, right? I kind of used the example last time, of the 2 children who's sitting, in first grade in a classroom, right? One of them has ADHD and one of them has been traumatized. They're displaying the same behaviors. They're fidgeting, right? Because they're sitting in the first row and the ADHD kid sits and fidgets, and the traumatized kid fidgets because he needs to see the door. He needs to see if somebody's coming in the door because he needs to scan for danger. So they're really having the same kind of behaviors. And that's why it's also always interesting to think about. One of the biggest work that I do is to figure out, where does behavior come from? What drives that? Because only if we understand what drives behavior can we come up with ways how to address it. Because if you don't understand what drives it, then we're going to do wrong things. Like we would give the traumatized child maybe a stimulant, and the stimulant makes his arousal level go even higher, right? And that's not a good thing. So we have to understand what drives behavior. So people who've experienced trauma, always on the peripheral, right? It has a profound impact on brain chemistry. So one of the things, for example, that people found in trauma studies is that people who have experienced trauma have less oxytocin levels. They, and the levels go down with the amount of trauma experienced, and they have high cortisol levels, right, or flight and fight response. So it's really interesting. So today, and hoping we can get to it, I was hoping to talk a lot about what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? The relationship between neurotransmitters and brain chemistry and experiences. And it really can go both ways. So traumatic experiences can change brain chemistry, but brain chemistry can also change behavior. So it's kind of an interesting thing, how it kind of correlates. So the oxytocin is, of course, responsible for attachment, for happiness, for mood, all these different kinds of things. So the next thing is that people. So the world is not a safe place. I cannot trust anybody, and I am not lovable. Those are the 3 core beliefs of people who've experienced trauma. Okay, those are the 3 core beliefs. And everything that comes in, all new information, is kind of viewed through that. People say, how does trauma affect adults? And that is a very good question. It depends on how people deal with trauma. Here's another kind of thing. There was a big study, the look of, and that's kind of leading into, my next piece is like, what are we going to do about all this? People historically have thought that therapy should be provided, therapy should consist of talk therapy, right? We're talking about things, cognitive behavior therapy, for example, is if we learn how to think differently, we will learn how to feel differently, which then in turn, helps us to behave differently, which makes perfect sense, right? If you go back to the example of, the date that stood you up, if you would think differently, if you think he's dead, right? He or she is dead somewhere, then you think your emotion is anxiety and, you're behaving in a certain way. So if you think about things differently, then will change our behavior. And for many people, that absolutely works. For people with developmental disabilities, it doesn't. Because cognitive behavior therapy for people who are processing expressive and receptive language issues is really kind of hard. And that was part of the beginning of our work, where we started to say, well, how else can we address behavior? So, the idea that, first of all, anybody who's experienced trauma, or the idea that anybody who is a bit different or might have some challenges or periods of depression either has to go to the psychiatrist or has to go and see a therapist is not true. Some people absolutely do, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with therapists. A psychiatrist, I just think that, sometimes, I think, and sometimes studies have proven that just by addressing, by developing holistic approaches to challenges, therapy may not necessarily be as necessary as previously thought. So there was a big study on people who've been traumatized, and the study has shown that half of the group went to therapy, the other half did not go to therapy, and the outcome was the same. So it's kind of an interesting thing, right? Because we often think, well, if you go see a therapist, that's a person you go to when something is wrong. However, I think as we go, and that's one of my favorite things to talk about, is really kind of as we learn more, we learn about really the holistic approach of addressing challenging behaviors. So if you look, for example, at the developmental pyramids, or if you look at the hierarchy of needs, on the bottom, and again, we talk a lot more about that, on the bottom is always the physiological processes. The cognitive perceptual ones are on the top, right? So at the bottom of developmental pyramid for children, that also has validation for behavior in adults, and in the hierarchy of needs, the physiological stuff is on the bottom. The way we sleep, what we eat, how well we take care of our sensory system, right? All those different kinds of things are at the bottom. So when we look at, for example, change behaviors or helping people change behaviors, that's where we always want to go first, right? So how do we do that? And a little bit more about trauma. So I'll tell you a story about a young woman who came to us, and that kind of, again, that's new for those of you who were here last time, but I think it really kind of exemplifies that, how trauma can be addressed, what trauma does to people, and how people, even with severe childhood trauma, can come all right at the other end, okay? So this young woman, I was called, by actually the health insurance in Massachusetts to go to a hospital, and there was a young woman there, she was 17, and she had lived in the hospital for a year. Her mother was a prostitute. She brought guys, home with her until, this child was 6, and she was at that point removed by child services. She was actually the one who told somebody in school, I believe, that, that this was happening. And she, for the longest time, blamed herself for breaking up the family, even though she got her and her sisters out of a very unsafe situation. She blamed herself for breaking up the family, which is a very kind of common thing of trauma and and abuse, that people blame themselves and say, this is all my fault, right? Particularly when kids are younger. Usually, if anything like this happens, or if parents get divorced, if the kids are under 8, they will often assume that it's their fault. No matter what you say, they will say, this is my fault. I know you're telling me it's not, but you're just doing that to make me feel better, right? So Amy from Atlanta, I really like your feedback phase too, thank you. So that is kind of, one of the things that you always see, that kids internalize those things, right? The other thing I have to let you know about trauma and sexual abuse is that any kind of trauma that causes shame is much harder to address, because people are much less likely to talk about it. And I think that in general was another kind of point I'm always trying to make. I think we have this kind of polarized world, right, of people who don't talk about childhood experience, who don't talk about, things that are really painful. And then you have that kind of medicalized piece where really, like last time, for example, I said to people that I've got ADD, right? I like my ADD. I feel bad for people who don't have it. It has worked out really good for me most of the time. And, but how often it took me, even as a social worker, it took me a few years to say, guys, I got ADD, because there was this kind of stigma attached to it, right? And I think if you would just share more, and it doesn't mean we have to dive into deep, dark secrets, but if we just would, look at that behavior is so human, and all of us have had good and bad experiences, I think the world would be a better place. To go back to my young woman. So she was in the hospital, and I came for 3 months. It was actually quite a ways away from here. I drove like about a couple of hours to a hospital, and she was just telling me in very uncertain terms what I could do with myself and where to go. And she did this several different times. She was a severe cutter. She had cuts all the way up her arms, all the way up her legs. It's a very common thing for people who've been traumatized in conjunction with sexual abuse to cut and, or to burn. So cutting and burning are the two kind of, trauma-related behaviors we see. And they really are to take emotional pain away. So if you think about it, physical pain, if the emotional pain becomes so big that you cannot bear it, the physical pain will take the emotional pain away, because at that point you can just focus on your body, and that it's almost like a painkiller. So it's not, as people say, it's a release or it's whatever. It's not attention seeking, none of that. If you have a 7th or 8th grader who does a little bit of a cut, once, that might be attention getting. If you have people who are, really compulsive cutters, and they cannot stop themselves, they are not suicidal. I think that is the other kind of thing that most cutters or most people who are burners, sometimes, kids and adults with like erasers, right? They will burn the skin with erasers. That it's not mistaken about, for suicidal ideation or suicidal behavior. It is really kind of an emotional pain reliever. I think that the risk that we often run is, and that is the first thing with cutters, is that, that accidentally they may cut themselves too deep, or accidentally they, will do harm to them that's irreparable. So, and again, one of the things is like, because cutting is so compulsive, the first thing is to say, not you cannot cut anymore. People will, or to remove what they call, sharps from their house. They will find things. They will break things, off pens. They will absolutely find things they can cut with. It's really kind of to look at less lethal method of cutting, saying, we really can't have that, but maybe you can have a piece of cardboard to help you, right? So it's kind of those things. So back to my young woman, and I drove there for months, and, she was not having it. She wasn't taking showers, by the way. I've never seen anybody who was quite in such a way of poor hygiene, but she was absolutely refusing. And it's one of the things you talked a little bit about, like, trauma-informed care. So the term trauma-informed care comes really from, making sure that when we work with people who are traumatized, that we're not re-traumatizing them, right? So for example, for her to have to go and take a shower as a victim of sexual abuse means that she's going to make herself attractive, and thus a great deal of vulnerability, right? And the vulnerability in itself re-traumatizes. If we're re-traumatizing, we enhance the trauma for people, and we never get to the point where the physiological process is that we are ready to work with them. Because we cannot work with people, we cannot teach them, we cannot engage them in activities if they are preoccupied with survival. And for many of the kids and young people who've experienced this level of trauma, it's really survival, right? So it's the same thing I used as an example for, if you would have a German Shepherd hanging on your ankle that's about to bite you, right? And I say, hey, let's learn some German, right? It wouldn't work. It doesn't work that way. So the first thing is to not re-traumatize kids. That's why if you go through the school systems now, for example, and to the social service agency, trauma-informed care is a huge big thing, which is just to avoid re-traumatizing people. This particular young woman, for example, had a huge issue with authority. She, until this day, I think maybe like a couple months ago, was the first time that she was able to go to, she was actually hospitalized, that she was able to wear Johnny in the hospital. She, for all these years, I mean, and I've been working with her now for like 18 years, she was never able to wear Johnny because it made her feel so vulnerable. Other people have huge issues with the dentist, right? There's nothing more, frightening than if you sit on the dentist chair and there's some guy hanging over you. It really leaves you powerless, right? So then we really need to be cautious that we're not re-traumatizing people. So it's the same thing with vulnerability, right? And so Next Jump does a wonderful job in looking at vulnerability as really kind of a great component to authenticity, right? But some of us might not be ready to have that degree of vulnerability because it is too frightening for us because of the trauma we experience and the level of, fear we might have associated with that. So, back to my young woman. So I drove there for 3 months. My last visit, I said, I'm going to go one more time. And if she's not going to react to me now, then I'm just going to be done with this, right? I've done my due diligence. And that's where she started talking to me. So she had all the classical symptoms of somebody who's really been severely traumatized. So I think, we addressed kind of similarly to, trauma-informed care also means that, sometimes we have to be creative. Creativity, and actually, that's one of the other things I was going to talk about at one point, was just kind of how we can learn to be creative. Creativity is a big part of social work. It's usually not associated with it, but it is. So for example, in order to make her not feel vulnerable, rather than having her to take showers, which we couldn't, she would come, by the way, and she would cut up her underwear, she would cut up her shirts, she would cut up her bras. And to have somebody with that degree of trauma go and take a shower and be pretty was just not working. So we took her to the Y swimming. So we went swimming under the umbrella of swimming. And, she got clean. She might have not shampooed her hair, but she was clean. Her health cleanliness was met. Everything else didn't matter. And that allowed us time. to just kind of start doing some of the things that we do. Sensory experiences like swimming, for example, we talked about last time that many behaviors are related to sensory stuff, right? That we are misunderstanding. And sensory, if you look at, again, the developmental pyramid, right after physiological comes sensory, right? Our sensory system. That is another primary need. And what you see, for example, with people who are traumatized, they're triggers for flashbacks. So what caused them to re-experience an event, right? Because that's one of the hallmarks of trauma, that people experience an event. And when they experience it close to the trauma itself, it comes back with the same velocity as the original event, right? Because if you think about it, we talked about a little bit last time about the difference between trauma and PTSD. PTSD, and this kid, had PTSD. So PTSD is not only defined in, the amount of time trauma systems stay with us, but also in our suppressing of things. So, this particular young woman had PTSD, and PTSD is good stuff. It is like emotional fainting, right? The same thing, for example, if you look at grief and loss, the first stage of grief and loss is denial. I'm trying to, again, mix things a little bit. The first stage of grief and loss is denial. And that is our emotional protective system to say, oh, too much pain. I cannot handle this right now. I have to say this didn't happen, right? The same thing with PTSD. It's like, people repress a memory because they cannot handle the amount of pain that's coming in. And that is another survival mechanism, just like when we faint with physical pain. So that is, again, where it's kind of really fascinating how things work. So this particular young woman, had a very, very significant avoidance mechanism. She would go catatonic. So she would go and she would drop and she wouldn't move and she wouldn't respond. And she was not physically catatonic, if you so will, but she was not moving, absolutely not moving. And it was all over the place. So, we went to the emergency room, once a week, at least, because she would go catatonic, something would always remind her. So it's a sensory experience that creates a flashback. For example, smells, right? Smells is the only sense of, the only sense that goes directly to your brain. It's not processed. So many times, if you think about vets, right, Vietnam vets, who smell like burning rubber, right, they might get a flashback. So a flashback is introduced by a sensory experience, either by a visual, something looks similar, something smells similar, something sounds similar, and that comes from the re-experience of the event. Because this kid had such a strong avoidance response, she just went catatonic, and she often was hospitalized. And then it was really interesting because, again, if you look at the stages of grief, and they're really important for trauma victims, of course, as well, because any trauma has to be grieved over, right? I mean, all of us right now, we are grieving because, we are in this kind of situation. But so then this particular young woman became angry. So then the catatonic piece, but before she was just catatonic, she at one point would, come to, she would not eat for like days at a time. At one point she would come to, and then in the next phase, she started being angry. So she would get catatonic, and then she would assault any ambulance drivers, police, anybody who, helped her manage her angry behaviors. So that went right along, kind of, again, with the stages of grief. So what we did, particularly with her, is, we did a lot of, again, trauma-informed care, and then we did a lot of animal work. And that is actually one of the things, I'm just going to throw that in there, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but we have found that many times with kids who are traumatized, particular kids who don't have a lot of language, or young people, I mean, she's a young woman now, she's in the 30s, that human interactions are too close. So, that kind of, dealing with people is too close to the trauma. Well, animals, dogs, horses, and I'm sorry that you can't see where we are. We actually have 4 farms. I'm sitting here and like the horses outside, they're just coming in, a bunch of miniature horses. So we're sitting on the farm. So animals really, teach traumatized people a lot about behavior, right? But it's not close, right? So you can ask, for example, you think the dog looks anxious? What do you think makes him or her anxious? It's not scary. But if you say to somebody, do you think that person looks anxious? It becomes scary. So we found that a lot of the trauma work we do away from people. And that just gives you a little bit of a glimpse. The other thing that we do is we do a lot of body work. So remember I said, if people who are traumatized, they numb their entire bodies, right? they numb their bodies, they don't feel anything. So therapy is always, if you think about it, right, from the inside out, right? We start with cognition, which again, for the population that we are working with is not working, right? We're starting with the bottom of the ventral pyramid, but we also, we also can work with the body sensation. So for example, we do a lot of therapeutic horseback riding, and therapeutic horseback riding gives you a lot of input, right? Particularly trotting. It allows people to feel, right? So it's the same thing like the kids on the spectrum. They love trotting because it gives a lot of input. So the emotional, the physical numbness of not feeling is being addressed by high impact activities. So for example, one of the recommendations of people who've experienced trauma is to do aerobic, rhythmical exercise, 30 minutes every day. And they're particularly liking basketball, dance, racket sports, things that provide, involve your limbs, have rhythm, and have a high impact, right? So it's kind of interesting, because it also goes back into our sensory stuff that we spoke about last time, that many behaviors that we see in children, particularly over the last 15 years, are sensory and are not really behavioral per se. So kids today, they don't develop the sensory systems that they used to, because they're not playing, hopscotch, they're not, hanging upside down from monkey bars. So they have really kind of sensory issues, which leads to sensory integration issues. So many times we see kids who are again constantly pounding, they're hanging on you, they want something all the time, right? It's really sensory behavior, and it's not bad behavior per se. So again, that's why it's important to kind of figure out where things come from. So I talked a little bit about more like what we did with this young woman, but today she's actually, she works in a doggy daycare. She has no problems with showers. She's well adjusted. She has a boyfriend. She has not gone catatonic. She has not been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons in 5 years or so. It was a long journey, but she was probably one of the most traumatized young people I've ever seen. So I think I will talk a little bit more about the journey, because that also goes into how we can change behaviors, right? But so I think it's important to realize also that there is light at the end of the tunnel. So that's a little bit about trauma. It was more than I wanted to say, but then somebody asked last time, just a little bit of a different thing. Well, now let me go back to this. So we talked a little bit more about abuse and neglect. What are the effects of abuse and neglect? And again, physical abuse, sexual abuse often results in power and control-seeking behaviors, lying, stealing, coercing, physical violence, bullying, hitting somebody. The top three: fire-setting, cruelty to animals, and pedophilia, usually is only committed by people who have been, by boys who have been significantly sexually abused or severely physically abused. So that is the top three. They are not your normal kind of, power and control seeking behaviors. We talked about, personality disorders. Somebody asked last time, we talked a little bit about borderline personality disorder, and somebody asked me questions like, what about narcissistic personality disorder? Now, so people with narcissistic personality disorder have again, there's a little bit of controversial kind of information. Some people think it's genetic. Some of the things, by the way, have an intergenerational component that I do not believe to be genetic. I believe that it's kind of a different way how people grow up. So people with narcissistic, personality disorder are often people who have been humiliated and severely degraded as young children. So they have significant low self-esteem. They have significant, devaluing experiences, or they were excessively, kind of praised for no particular reason. They were like the best thing without any kind of achievement. So people with narcissistic personality disorder have a significant need for, respect, acknowledgement without any achievement. They're very sensitive to criticism. They have to be admired at all costs. They're fascinated with power, with control. They have to, they're fascinated with status. I'm sure all of you know one or two of those people. So that is kind of narcissistic personality disorder. And again, just because you're asking, I figured I'd just mention that. So how do we work? Now that's quarter off. How do we work really to change behaviors? And why are behaviors so difficult to change? The one way we cannot change behavior is come from the top down. Unless, again, you are you're very committed to psychotherapy and you can really kind of take advantage of it. But we also established last time is an insight into a behavior doesn't mean you can change it. just because you know why you are the way you are does not mean you can change it, right? Because behavior has a purpose. We get something out of a behavior. We cannot simply stop doing it. We have to replace what the purpose of the behavior is with something that functions better for you. And that's the replacement piece. None of us can just stop doing something. We replace, right, with something that works better. So that is part of the, kind of work around replacing behaviors. The other one is also, again, dynamics that's often used in positive behavior supports in schools to, again, figure out what drives the behavior, right? So the behaviors that are linked to childhood experiences and really core beliefs are much more complex and harder to change than behaviors we see, for example, a kid not liking math class, right? And the kid is like being disruptive, so he's going to be sent to the principal, and therefore he can avoid math class, right? And if we don't understand why he's doing it, then guess what? He's going to the principal a lot, and he's not going to learn math, because by sending him to the principal, we're reinforcing that behavior. That is a very kind of behaviorist approach, and it is to extinct a particular behavior, replace it. The behaviors that involve trauma are much more complex, right? Because again, we have to replace some of the things. So part of the things that's really important when we look at the physiological piece is really to look at, having a whole kind of body approach. Historically, again, things like nutrition, sleep hygiene, sleep hygiene, sensory experiences, fresh air, sunshine, those kinds of things have really not been historically part of a way how to change behaviors. It very much is. So for example, one of the things that Shana asked me about the parents who have kids with disabilities is, they're really struggling. Well, what can we do, right? And part of it is, for example, kids who might have had OT, like occupational therapy, they might not get that at home. So we have to think about, when we think about changing and when we think about managing the situation, how do we set everybody up for success? How do we set the kids up on a military base in Hawaii so that they can succeed? How do we set each other up for success? And it starts by a whole life approach, right? I'm not going to come in and say, I don't know, Pam, I'm going to change who you are, right? By just telling you how to change, and you look at me and say, yes, no, I know I'm not going to do this anymore. This is like not how it works. For every person we work with, co-workers, kids, we think about how can we set them up for success? What is their social stamina, their ability to tolerate successful social context? What is their sensory profile, right? So one of the things that actually that we had talked with NextJump a lot is everybody here in our agency can set up their office space according to their own sensory profile. I had mentioned to you yesterday that clearly I'm a sensory seeker. My office is fire engine red and has clutter all over, right? But it helps me work. If I would go to my coworker's George's office, his office is some weird salmon color. There's nothing on the wall. Everything is straight, right? And I would be, where's the action here, right? I could not be productive, right? So how do we set people up for success? When NextJump has, their presentations, what degree of vulnerability can somebody tolerate? Right? What is really the foundation of which we can build on, kind of moving on. If you also think that in the developmental pyramid, it's a lot because the time is over, I'm trying to cram things in, but the next peak is actually reflexes and gross motor, right? So for example, if you even think about children, we've talked about the timeout concept, right? For kids I'm supposed to stop. I was just going to get my gross motor things in. So in any event, for kids who have difficulty, to go and to sit in timeout is really not a good thing, because it's an upward emotion, right? Kids can regulate by engaging their gross motor system, by jumping up and down, right? And if you look at the developmental pyramid, that is where it makes a lot of sense to create spaces for kids to have an opportunity to engage in those kinds of activities without having to sit still.